So my name is Betsy. I'm the Advocacy and Campaign Manager here at Northwest Steelheaders, and I do all of our state advocacy work to protect salmon habitats, fishing access. I work on the Columbia River allocation and Columbia River gillnet reform and all of these different things to make sure that your voices as anglers are represented in both the state level policy decisions as well as even at the federal level. And so I am excited for you all to be here today because we have some really exciting news about what's going on the Snake River that I'm really excited to fill you guys in on. And I also really want to be able to spend some time today giving you guys skills to engage in your advocacy process and engage in the political process, whether it's about the Simpson proposal for Snake River restoration, which we'll be talking about today, or if you want to use these skills and advocate for any of the things that you care about. These are very useful ways to engage with your legislators on these types of topics. And so, great. So let me get started. So we're about a year into COVID and electronic living. So I'm sure a lot of us have spent some level of time here on Zoom, but I do just want to make sure, can you guys see my screen share still? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I lost the green box. So, but yeah, so just a couple of Zoom ground rules. So first, mute your microphone, please, just to eliminate background noise. I do have a number of videos that I'm going to be showing today. And so I don't want those to be getting any background noise to be kind of interfering with those. But we will have a Q&A section a couple of different times throughout the call today. And so if at that point you do want to ask a question, I invite you to turn your camera back on and unmute yourself and kind of engage that way. So yeah, those are just some of the Q&A features. The other thing is, if you go into the participants page, you can see a raise hand feature down at the bottom, and that can also let us know that you want to ask a question during the Q&A. So I hope you use those features. And today we're really going to be talking about Lower Snake River restoration. That's the primary focus of our conversation today. I have been working on this campaign for a little over a year now, and so I'm really excited to be able to serve as a resource for you guys about what's been going on, what the conversations are, and what the opportunity is that exists right now. And so we're going to spend the first part of this conversation tonight talking about that to make sure you guys are all well versed in what is going on. And then I'm going to pivot and talk a little bit about grassroots advocacy and why that is such an important component of this campaign to make sure that this restoration project can go through. And then I will go through kind of best practices on how to contact your legislator. And I'll actually call Senator Wyden. He's my senator here in Oregon, and do that on the call so you can all see what that process is like. And then I'll give you the opportunity to also call your legislator about this issue, and I'll provide you a script and all of those things. So that's kind of the layout for what we're doing today. But first, I do want to get to know you all. And so I'm doing my very first Zoom poll. So let's see how it goes. But I just have 3 quick questions just to kind of get a feel for who's here, who's joining us. So you should have seen a couple of questions pop up on your screen. I'm curious where folks are joining us from, what your age is, and I don't know why this isn't showing the full question, but have you ever contacted your legislator before? Just to get a feel for where you guys are at and what your skill level might be in terms of these types of conversations. Wow, pretty good split between Washington and Oregon. Awesome. And some Idaho and other folks represented. Thanks for joining us. We have a strong footprint here in Washington and Oregon, but I'm glad to see that people are joining us from other places. And wow, a lot of you guys have contacted your legislators, which is also awesome. So we can kind of use this as like a best practices. I mean, it sounds like based off of these poll responses that many of you have. And so if you have questions about what the best way is or why you would contact one person versus another or those types of things, I'm really happy to get into kind of troubleshooting around those types of questions when we get into the question and answer. So great, thank you. I'm glad that worked well. I'll have to do that more. So first, I just want to kind of make sure that we're all kind of on the same page in terms of the geographic footprint, the area that I'm really talking about. The Columbia River Basin is huge. Wait, stop sharing.
That's me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the Columbia River Basin is huge. It spans an area about the size of France, and it takes up a lot of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. Actually, almost all of Idaho is within the Columbia River Basin. And there are a number of dams within this basin. There was a large effort in the early 1900s to really use the vast rivers in this region to provide hydroelectric energy for the developments and settlements that were happening in this region, or industrial development and things like that. And so we are really focusing on this white circle, these 4 dams right here on the lower Snake River. These dams were put in between 1950 and 1970, and they block access to this entire blue region of what was historically accessible salmon habitat. So about a third of the US portion of the basin is inaccessible to salmon and steelhead as a result of these 4 dams explicitly. And that has had a dramatic impact on as many things. I mean, it's a multi-pronged reason as to why salmon species and salmon runs are declining so dramatically throughout the Northwest, but these dams have been proven scientifically by agency science, independent science, academic science. Any 20 years worth of science has proved that these dams are really one of the primary contributors to that decline. And so today we're focusing on the removal of those 4 dams. And just to kind of highlight and put it into perspective, this is a graph that was included in Trout Unlimited. They put out a state of the science report that last year, I keep thinking it's still this year, but last year in 2020, describing the state of the science about dam removal on the lower Snake River and how those dams impact these runs. And so you can see that before the 4 dams, we're looking at Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, Little Goose, and John Day. No, not John Day, Lower Granite, my apologies, the way that was written. Those are the 4 lower Snake River dams. And so you can tell that as these dams were constructed, our salmon runs declined pretty intuitively and immediately as a result. And in 1993 is when 13 runs were listed. And so you can see that it's pretty cyclic in terms of how the runs change over time, but we also can tell that even at their highest points, these runs are nowhere near where they were historically. Idaho's runs at this point, about 1% of the salmon that are spawned in Idaho as juveniles are able to return and spawn again. And so that means 1 out of every 100 salmon that are born in Idaho can make it home to start a new generation. And so this is really impacting why we're seeing such precipitous declines in this region. If we can get more salmon home, then more wild salmon home, we're going to have a better chance of larger run sizes. And Representative Mike Simpson out of Idaho has started to realize that, like many of us. And so he, last week or a couple of weeks ago now, released what he's referring to as the Columbia Basin Fund, which is his proposal for comprehensive salmon recovery. And I'll let him speak to what that means.
Idaho's salmon are wonders of nature. Ultra-marathoners that make an 1,800-mile round trip from Idaho's highest mountains to the Pacific and back, climbing 1.3 miles in altitude in the process. Our high-elevation rivers and streams possess some of the coldest, cleanest, and nutrient-rich spawning grounds. But the historical plentiful runs of the Snake and Salmon rivers are no more. In 2019, just 3,763 wild adult spring Chinook salmon returned to spawn in Idaho, about 4% of the historical total, despite spending over $17 billion on salmon recovery and management.
Now, while the Salmon River is raging with spring runoff, a few wild sockeye smolts are riding that wave. Another one. When they reach the 8 slackwater pools that have replaced the naturally flowing river system, warm water, predators, and the stress of the hydroelectric turbines will kill most of them.
The current system is clearly not working. So we are asking some very difficult what-if questions. What if the dams came out? What if we were able to replace the energy from the dams? What if we came up with different ways of transporting grain? What if we created new economic engines for our communities? So for the past 3 years, we've conducted over 300 meetings with smart, dedicated people on all sides of the Northwest salmon dam issue. We came to realize the complexities and challenges that have prevented the Northwest from finding workable solutions. Since 1937, 8 hydroelectric dams have been built on the lower Columbia and Snake Rivers, providing clean, reliable, low-cost energy throughout the Northwest. Humans have adapted, producing energy, transporting agricultural goods at lower costs, and creating irrigation and recreational opportunities. But unfortunately, the salmon haven't adapted. The dams create barriers to passage and produce slow-moving reservoirs of water that imperil their existence. Other factors are also working against the salmon, including poor ocean conditions and warm rivers from climate change. My staff and I approached this challenge with the idea that there must be a way to restore Idaho salmon and keep the 4 lower Snake River dams. But after exhausting dozens of possible solutions, we weren't able to find one that could control poor ocean conditions, warming rivers, and the 4 lower Snake dams. In the end, we realized there is no viable path that can allow us to keep the dams in place. I don't claim to know what the best answer is for each sector. However, I do know that if we give the farmers, bargers, ports, the BPA, and communities the necessary resources, each sector can develop a certainty and security, putting the Northwest and Idaho salmon on a path to sustained viability. Working together as a delegation, and with the governors, stakeholders, and conservationists, we can create a Northwest solution that ends the salmon wars and puts the Northwest and our energy systems on a certain, secure, and viable path for decades and restores Idaho salmon. We must also not forget the Columbia Basin tribes. Their culture and heritage revolved around the return of salmon. We must make these tribes equal partners in the solution, and going forward, they must be co-equal partners in salmon restoration. I want to be clear that I'm not certain removing these dams will restore Idaho's salmon and prevent their extinction. But I am certain that if we do not take this course of action, we are condemning Idaho's salmon to extinction.
All right. So, it's gonna erase. Sorry about that. Technologic difficulties. As you would imagine. Okay. So, I don't know. Okay. Sorry about that. So, yeah. Simpson, Representative Simpson, a conservative Republican in Idaho, released this, what he's referring to as a Columbia Basin Fund. And as you heard in the video, he and his staff spent 3 years having over 300 meetings with all kinds of different sectors, whether it's the power producers, the agricultural growers, the folks who ship goods on barge down the river, the ports, all of the different folks that you can think of. Of course, us as anglers, our community was also, the conservation community was included in those meetings as well. And he says it point blank. He wanted to go into that situation, that planning process, finding a way to save salmon without removing those dams, and he just couldn't find it. And that's because those dams have such a huge impact. And so his proposal is much more than a salmon recovery opportunity. Of course, it is that at its root, it's anchored in that and the removal and restoration of that lower Snake River. But it's much bigger than that. It's an infrastructure bill. It's it's not a bill yet, but it's a proposal for a modern system of road, rail, and energy throughout the entire Northwest. It's not Idaho specific, it's not Washington specific, it's a series of investments into the basin as a whole. And if you go to his website, he has an incredible amount of detail about what he thinks the necessary solutions need to include. And just a couple of pieces of those I would love to go through with you. If the video will let me. And so there are many different things in this in his proposal for the fund. It's a $33 billion with a B billion-dollar fund that he is proposing. And while that sounds like a lot, it's less than 2% of what the infrastructure package that Biden is trying to get through the Senate this year. So it does have a large price tag, but when you put that price tag in context of what our government is planning on spending or trying to spend on infrastructure in the coming year, it's really not a big component of that as a whole. But it does include huge packages of funding that will dramatically improve a lot of the sectors within our region. So first, when it comes to the fishing community and our interest in water and kind of riparian habitat, of course, 1/30th of his proposal is to breach the 4 lower Snake River dams. It includes the dredging and all of the sediment work that would be involved in that process. And he is proposing that that take place between 2028 and 2030. He also has included significant amounts of funding for both fish passage past Grand Coulee, which I think is a huge one for those living in the upper Columbia Basin, but also $700 million in hatchery production for the entire basin. A lot of money to support Northwest watershed partnerships throughout the basin, so a lower Columbia River partnership and mid-river, all of these different places to really focus on work, site-specific work that needs to happen where all of the partners in that area are able to come together and agree that that's a thing that needs to be done. So providing funding to really support those efforts. And then also $75 million in a salmon conservation corps. And this is really a conservation corps, kind of the idea of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, but really digging into the on-the-ground restoration piece, the plantings, the riparian floodplain type of work and all of that stuff. So those are, I think, are some of the major pieces that I think are really interesting for us as anglers. There is a lot more in it. For example, all of the land currently inundated underneath those reservoirs would be transferred into a lower Snake River National Recreation Area managed by the BLM. Marina work, all kinds of different things going on the recreation side. But again, it's not just a salmon and recreation plan, it's an energy and transportation plan as well. And so because that river system provides a barging transportation system, he's also included $600 million for multimodal, so road and rail transportation hubs that growers can use to move their goods out to market. New wind and solar facilities to produce significantly more energy than what those dams produce now. Those dams produce a very minimal amount of energy to the grid. And so by investing $10 billion in new wind and solar infrastructure and $12 billion in grid work, I mean, that's really where you're getting a significant amount of energy production, like way more than what we have right now. And that also kind of gives us the climate resilience in our grid system to kind of guarantee that, I mean, I don't want to say guarantee that we won't experience some of the things that other portions of this state or this country have experienced in the past month with power outages and things like that, but dramatically increasing our storage capacity and transmission ability and distribution ability in our energy grid. Those are the key pieces as to why some of like Texas lost a lot of the power that they had. And so it's an example of building a more resilient energy system that's capable of handling changing climate as well. And then, of course, he also has included a significant amount of funding to promote tourism in the region and provide more riverfront, waterfront revitalization projects and things like that for those communities like Tri-Cities and Lewiston that would have a very different waterfront experience than what they have right now. Not to say it would be, I think it would be better, but I am also a free-flowing water person. And so I'm biased in that way. So that's Simpson's proposal. And I would really like to take a moment and just clarify questions. There's a lot of conversation going on around Simpson's proposal. And because I'm really trying to teach you how to talk to your legislators about this, I want to make sure that I can address any of the questions that you might have. So I'm going to stop sharing and provide an opportunity. If you have any questions right now, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I'd be happy to answer anything. And if not, we can move on. But I do want to create space for that because this is a huge proposal and there's been a lot of conversation about it in the media. All right. I'm not seeing any questions. So feel free to, oh, Chris is connecting to audio. So maybe we do have a question. And you can also include your questions in the chat if you'd like. We can also address them that way. All right. Why is it going the wrong way?
Hey, Bessie.
Yeah.
This is Tom.
Yeah.
What do you think the current views of our senators is of this proposal? Do you have a feel for what their current view of it is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so he released this on Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday. And we thought that it would be a pretty quiet release and that we wouldn't hear a lot from the legislators immediately. And we were surprised in that all 4 of the Washington and Oregon senators released a statement that evening saying, yeah, not so much like we are full force supporting this, but very much saying that salmon recovery would require a comprehensive solution and that it needs to bring all of these different sectors to bear and that it needs to be much bigger than dams versus salmon. And so there was a lot of support in that way. Since then, our senators have not, no one has come out as a co-sponsor. No one has come out and said, yes, I strongly support this bill. And that is why I'm hoping I can get all of you guys to contact your legislators as a result of this call, because that's the big piece that we need. The reality is this proposal is going to catch a ride on either the infrastructure bill or some other form of a budget bill. And those bills are hopefully there's a goal in the Biden administration to have an infrastructure bill by the 4th of July or by Memorial Day. So this is something that's moving. Legislative text is going to be written in the next month or 2 months. And so we really need our senators to come on board. In terms of the folks that have been like really oppositional publicly are representatives in Eastern Washington, and Herrera Butler in Washington. Kathy McMorris Rogers has been historically disinterested in dam removal conversations, and she's continued to tell that line. And so Dan Newhouse. So there's a number of different people at play, I guess. Since most of you guys are in Oregon and Washington, I guess I'll say the primary targets that we have in Washington in terms of folks that we really need to move to get on board with this proposal are Derek Kilmer and Maria Cantwell, and then McMorris Rogers. So those 3 in Washington are our primary targets. And then down here in Oregon, Senator Wyden and Merkley, Wyden, because he's chair of the finance committee, and so this is clearly a very large financial footprint, and so getting him on board is a big piece of getting that shepherd through budget. And then DeFazio, because he's chair of House Transportation and Infrastructure, so he's the other major target that we have down here. On the Idaho side of things, their major target, clearly Representative Simpson released the plan, but the people that they're really trying to move there is Senator Crapo. So those are kind of the top tier regional delegate targets. And the reality is if we can't get more regional delegates to get on board with this, other folks are not, you know, like someone from Vermont, someone from Georgia, like those folks aren't going to be interested in a large spending bill and conservation restoration bill that their own regional delegates aren't behind. And so that's why the focus has been so significantly on trying to get those folks bought in. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yes, thank you, Betsy.
Awesome.
Hello, Betsy.
Yeah.
I do have a couple of questions.
All right.
You have a very large spending bill, and right now we're tied up with trying to get a COVID relief bill passed, and everybody's screaming it's way out of line. Number two question would be the monies that are being collected from folks that use the Columbia River fishery. What has occurred with that? Does anybody have a readout on how much money is in the pot or not in the pot, or what is Oregon doing to support the program?
Yeah, so great questions. First, about the spending piece. The way that I've been hearing Simpson respond to that question, because that is clearly one of the bigger questions coming out about the proposal, just in the context of where we are economically right now. It's basically along the lines of, we've spent $17 billion over 20 years, and we don't have much to show for it in terms of our runs increasing. So we can continue on that path. We can continue spending $17 billion over the next 20 years, and all of the legal fees, all of the planning fees that go into these like never-ending lawsuits. I mean, but the conservation community has been in court with the federal government over these dams for many, many, many years. And so the overarching societal cost is much larger than that $17 billion. So we can either continue on that path and end up in a situation where our salmon go extinct anyways. Idaho salmon go extinct, which is, you know, we fish on a mixed stock run. So those are some of our fish that we're capable, that impact our harvestability, I guess. Or we can be strategic in how we want to spend that money, and we can remove these dams and make sure that we can spend $33 billion being proactive about what a solution looks like that makes everyone more resilient and strengthens our economy as a whole regionally. Or we can continue on this trend that we're still on, where we're really not seeing big benefits. So that's the first one. The second one about the Columbia River endorsement, that is a state fee that we all pay to fish on the Columbia River and its tributaries. And it generates a sizable amount of money to support ODFW. Washington no longer pays an endorsement. They got rid of their endorsement a number of years ago. And that funding is used, well, it was supposed to be collected to be used towards like enhancing hatchery production for off-channel gillnet harvests and things like that, different things that were included in the 2013 Columbia River reforms. So that funding is an important source of funding for projects that ODFW uses, but these dams are not owned or operated by the state. The dams in Eastern Washington are federal dams. And so any decision around what happens with them has to happen at a federal level. So even if, I mean, our governor, Governor Brown here in Oregon, my governor, many of you are not in Oregon, has been a very steadfast supporter of dealing with these dams and finding a solution. And so she is engaging in the process in that way, but her department, her administration, it does not have jurisdiction over what happens with these dams. And so that funding that we pay through the endorsement can't go towards any type of adjustment on these dams, I guess. So we do have a number of other things that I want to get through, so I'm going to keep going, but we have 2 more question and answer breaks, so I'll be sure to open it back up for questions in a moment. Share screen. Okay. Share. So grassroots environmental advocacy is a very important part, kind of what I was just mentioning with Tom's question around our delegates need to get involved in this plan. Our delegates need to talk to Simpson's office and finesse his proposal, which is really just a list of bulleted points of like things that need to be addressed in any solution. Our delegates need to engage with him to finesse that list of bullet points into legislative text, right? That can be passed as a bill. And an important way to do that, to build political will, especially on a campaign that's been going on for 20 years with very little shift, is through grassroots advocacy. That's an important part. And rather than me kind of explain to you what that is, I figured we could just watch this short little video. So. Well, that might be a little cheesy. I think it does a really good job of describing that advocacy is a big word that describes a lot of different things, right? You can be advocating for legislation like we are, advocating our political delegates to get involved in legislation. But other forms of advocacy on this issue that I do are media. I'm always looking for people to write letters to their editor of local papers to make sure to amplify issues with people who read that paper. Pre-COVID, large events are also big opportunities for advocacy. Those types of things are all ways of demonstrating that there is a community that cares about this issue and wants to see something change. But there are also some really important best practices around advocacy that are important to keep in mind. And so we put together an advocacy tackle box for our membership to really understand how best to get engaged. And so I want to take a moment and just show you where that lives on our website. So on our home page, you can go to our work, advocacy tackle box. And this takes you to another webpage that just has a lot of different information about how to advocate for the things that you care about. So you can either download the entire tackle box here, or you can look at different sections that we wrote out. And so one is about how to email your elected officials and make sure that you're getting the best of it there. Today, we're going to talk about calling. Town halls are another important form of advocacy. They're a bit difficult right now just because of the online nature. It can be really difficult to get FaceTime with legislators that way. But they're a really good way to talk and get a good feel for the things that legislators care about. So you can start to kind of frame the way you talk to them. Like if you know that someone really values rivers, for example, Senator Wyden just released or introduced a gigantic Wild and Scenic River Act. Clearly, rivers and river health is a major thing that he cares about. And so when I am calling his office about this issue, those are the things that I would want to tie in, right? Because that's something I know is salient and something his office is concerned about. So town halls are a good way to get a feel for that type of stuff. And then, like I had mentioned, letters to the editor. I think a lot of folks think that the opinion section of a newspaper is not that useful anymore, but I will say that legislators read that section of the newspaper. That is like a major way that legislators know what their community cares about. And so when we get things placed in that opinion section, it really signals to them that this is something that matters. And it also signals to the newspaper that this is something that people care about. And so they will start to try to include more content about that topic in their writing and their own reporting. So that's another really important way of just amplifying something that might be happening that you want folks to know about. So we're going to talk about calling your legislator. So I'm going to come back to my presentation. So a couple of best practices. You want to make sure that you have talking points prepared. Maybe that's not a script. Maybe you aren't a script reader and you want to be a bit more authentic, but you want to go into the call kind of having an idea of what you want to say. And that's mostly because to be most effective, you need this message to be less than 3 minutes. And so having a map out of what you want to say before you get there can help you make the best of that time. And it's also important that what your talking points include a purpose for your call. If you're mentioning, if you're talking about a specific bill, in this case, we're talking about Representative Simpson's Columbia Basin Fund, you want to specifically mention what you're talking about and provide a specific ask. What are you asking that person to do? Are you asking them to co-sponsor something? Are you asking them to introduce a bill into their committee that they oversee? Are you asking them to provide some sort of feedback or statement in support of the bill? These are different things that you can ask from a legislator, and you need to kind of have that ask mapped out for yourself in advance. Also, it's best practice to introduce yourself as their constituent and tell them what city and zip code that you live in. If you don't say it at the get out, they will just ask you. And the point there is that you can only advocate about things that you care about to your own representatives, right? I live in Portland, Oregon. I cannot call a representative in Missouri about something going on in Missouri because I don't live there. He's not my representative. That person doesn't care what I think, honestly. And so that's their way of filtering out whether or not you're their constituent and that they need to listen to you. So always make sure to tell them that you are. And then an important thing to remember is that you're really trying to persuade them to do something. And so kind of what I was mentioning about understanding the values of the legislator, that can help you be more compelling to them. If you can come up with some sort of talking point that aligns with the things that they care about, they're going to be more interested in listening to you. And I guess all of this to say, one of the big questions I get is well, why phone calls? Can't I just email them? It's so much easier to email people. I can just do it with a couple of clicks, and that's that. And it's true. It is really easy to email your legislators. And that matters. That's a very important part. Flooding a legislator's inbox with emails about an issue, again, amplifies to them, oh, this is something people care about. I need to pay attention to it. But also, every member of Congress every week gets a memo from their legislative staff that describes basically a column. It's like a table where all of the topics of phone calls that they've received are about, and then the number of people who called in support of that topic and the number of people who called in opposition to that topic. And so it's really important when you're working on a national campaign like this, I mean, this is a campaign that has national significance, that we get on that list, right? Like we want to be on our legislators' phone call memo every week so that they know people are continuing to call about this. This isn't a one and done type of thing. It's a steady drumbeat of people being concerned about it, as opposed to a really big groundswell that kind of dies out over time. And so that's why I'm hoping that these conversations that we have today can help you. I mean, honestly, I just programmed all of my senator and representatives' phone numbers into my phone book on my phone, and I pour myself coffee in the morning and I just call all my legislators and I tell them about Snake River and I tell them about the other things that I personally care about advocating on behalf of. And it's less than 10 minutes and I got all 3 of my representatives in and I'm on to breakfast. And so it's really not that big of an ask, or that big of a task, I guess, rather. But it has a huge impact on the legislative agenda of that specific person that you're calling. So I'll leave with that, I guess. And so just to kind of show, I mean, I know that a number of you have done it, but I want, the other big question that I get is, oh, well, how do you call a legislator? You know, like, what is that process? What is it like? And I'll say that right now, all of the staffers will be gone. So we'll get voicemail messages when we call. But if you call during hours, oftentimes you're talking to someone who is either in their undergrad, just finished their undergrad. And, you know, it's just a short, quick conversation. They're like, hey, what are you calling about? Okay, got it. Anything else you want to ask about? Okay, perfect. Bye. That's kind of the extent of it. So I will call my senator, Senator Wyden, just to kind of show you what it's like. This might be way too quiet. Try to hold it up.
Hello, you reached the Portland office of Senator Ron Wyden. If you would like to leave a comment for the senator, please do so at the tone. If you are seeking assistance, please leave us a detailed message and we will be in touch with you shortly. Thank you again for your call and for your patience and flexibility during these extraordinary days.
Hello, my name is Betsy Emery. I am calling, or I'm your constituent living in Portland, Oregon, 97211. I am calling about Representative Simpson's historic proposal for a Columbia Basin Fund to recover abundant salmon throughout the Columbia River Basin by restoring a free-flowing lower Snake River. His proposal will bring much needed stimulus and stability to our region and modernize our regional energy, irrigation, road, and rail infrastructure. Simpson's proposal is our last chance to restore wild salmon and steelhead, protect our world-class fishing industry, and ensure future generations will experience the joy of catching salmon. For Simpson's proposal to be successful, Wyden needs to engage with his office to shape that proposal into a legislative package that our region can support. I hope that he will get involved. Thank you for your time. Bye. And that's it. Like literally you just do that. And then in the morning, someone will come in and listen to all those voicemails and put it into the memo. So that I think is an important way to do it. So the other thing I just want to say is that if you don't know your senator's phone number, there is, I'm trying to find the number. There's a switchboard number. Oh, that's not coming up. You can Google, you can either, so there's 2 ways that you can find your legislative person if you don't know who your representatives are. You can go to govtrack.us That's a website where you can just type in your zip code and it will tell you who your federal senators are and your one representative. And those are the 3 people who represent you in Washington, D.C. And I find it easiest to call their district office. I feel like I get the best luck getting through to that. But all of those representatives have district offices and Washington, D.C. offices. And so sometimes it makes sense to call a Washington, D.C. office, for example, if there is a vote coming up or a committee hearing that you know is happening and you want something. But if it's kind of more of an informational call or something like that, the district office can be more useful in that way. So at that point, I'll stop sharing and I'll open it up to questions again and see what kinds of questions you guys might have about that type of advocacy. I know there's
Betsy, you might look in your chat. You've got a couple questions there.
Yeah. Do you feel? I don't have a pulse on secretaries of commerce or energy. I do know that if Deb Haaland is pegged as Department of Interior, that would likely be a good fit just because, or a good advocate, because she has a strong, I mean, she's an Indigenous woman and this is a largely driven by Indigenous community campaign. And Biden is in strong support of an infrastructure bill. He dramatically wants to see that happen. So he has, our campaign, like the broader Snake River campaign, has been in touch with his transition team. So they do know about this proposal, but I don't know about any statements of support. Tom, how can we advocate for action and stop the continued studies and make a business case that includes fish? Yeah, how can we advocate for action and stop the continued studies? I mean, I think that this is a multi-pronged approach, you know, I think having some sort, so I think there will always be some level of study happening. Even if those dams happen and they are removed, there will still be study about what's going on, how it's changing, what's happening in other basins, are all of the salmon returning the best, like what's happening with temperature. I don't see that stuff changing, but I do see the significant amount of money we're putting into this wheel that continues to roll and not change at all. That will shift and we'll be able to move money into more meaningful projects. And I think that will be a huge benefit. And I think the business case, we have a strong business voice in NSIA, the National Sport Fishing Industry Association, and they are also strongly looped in on this. And a number of our guides have been meeting with our delegates to make sure that their local voice is included in the conversation as well. And so I think those are important ways to make those conversations heard. At this point, I think a lot of that stuff is happening kind of internal conversations with legislators. Like, hey, I'm a grower, hey, I'm a guide, hey, my livelihood depends on this and I need to see it. And we also have been seeing a lot of that play out in the media. We have seen the owner of Yakima Bait Company. He wrote a big op-ed last week or 2 weeks ago saying that, you know, this is necessary if his business is going to continue. And we are working with the owner of Fisherman's Outdoor and Marina on similar types of messaging. And so yeah, the business community is strongly affected by something like this. And that voice is huge in getting movement. I mean, if salmon decline was going to get comprehensive restoration, it would have happened 10 years ago, right? Like that, unfortunately, is not what is moving legislators, but money, impacts to livelihood, justice-oriented conversations, the, you know, economic viability of rural communities. These are the things that are moving this issue. And those are the things that people really, our delegates are really caring about seeing changed. I'm not sure how often to call, daily, weekly. So they get a weekly memo that is, and it includes the number of times that people called. So if you call weekly in support of Snake River restoration, that means that the Snake River restoration is going to have a minimum of 7 positive supporting people in that column. And that's better than 1, in my opinion. So yeah, I call my legislator, or I try to call them as often as I can. And so if you want to put a reminder in your phone to do it once a week, that's great. If you want to do it every other day, if you want to do it every day over coffee, whatever. I mean, the more often, the better. But it's also a big ask. So whatever works for your schedule, I think, is the most appropriate. And yeah, Tom, we are recording this actually. And so we're going to do similar to what we did with our panel in terms of posting this presentation on our website and then making sure it's available for folks. And then great, I'm glad that Rob dropped in the Capitol switchboard number. So if you don't know who your representative is, you can call that number and you'll put your zip code in and they will give you the phone numbers of who your representatives are. So that's a great resource too. And is it better to call the local office or DC? On this issue, it has kind of just become a DC conversation when Simpson released this. So up until a couple of weeks ago, this was very much a regional conversation happening in district offices with legislators. And now that someone has come out with like an actual concept of what a bill could look like, it has become something of interest in DC. And so there has been requests to kind of start calling the DC offices as well. So I have a relationship, I feel like, with the Portland office just because of my advocacy work. So I call them more so, but I think the DC office, and in reality, like the district offices talk to the DC offices, it's not siloed. But yeah, either of those I think are good avenues for this. I think you would only want to call DC once it got to a point where it was like a bill, right? Like if there was a bill introduced, if it was going into a hearing or something like that, then you would be calling the DC people because they're there, they're on the ground and they can do quicker work, if that makes sense. All right, any other questions? I want to make sure that you have time to call your own legislator with this script, but I also want to make sure that I have time to answer questions. So doing one more pulse on that.
Betsy, is there any benefit to having a non-constituent make a call to a leading senator or representative? I mean, Maria Cantwell or some other, does it do any good for me as an Oregonian to call a Washington delegation person?
No, it does not. The one time it does matter, or the one time you kind of have the ability to call someone outside of your constituent, is if they are like chair of a committee. So for example, I don't live in Peter DeFazio's district anymore. He represents Eugene and Corvallis and like the southwest portion of Oregon, but he's the chair of the House Infrastructure and Transportation Committee. And so when we had a bill in his committee that had a lot of provisions for salmon recovery in it, we had the ability to kind of push on him that way because we were pushing on him as a chair instead of pushing on him as our constituent, if that makes sense. So for like 95% of the time, it won't get you anywhere. Like basically as soon as they find out what your zip code is, they'll tell you no. But when we're in kind of a committee situation and they are like on the committee or the chair of the committee, that kind of changes up the game plan. So I did just post the script into the chat and feel free to tweak it, edit it, make it more personal if you want. I think personal stories are a really important way to let people know about why this issue matters to you and letting them know kind of your personal connection to the issue, I guess. And that makes it more memorable to them too as a staffer. Because if they get the same form, it's the same as us. Every time we get a form email, form phone call, that kind of stuff, it's just like in one ear out the other. But staffers also play a role in moving their legislators. And so when we can plant stories that last with them, they also kind of play advocates for us, if that makes sense. Like when you tell a staffer a really compelling story about how salmon decline has impacted, the livelihood of a multi-generation guiding business, for example, that's a story that is, sits with someone much more than the form script that I read, So a couple of things there too, in terms of personalizing it, I think those are important considerations. All right, any other questions? We're right at time.
My one question, and that would be, so I'm calling it or watching this from Ohio, and I didn't know if it would be prudent at this point to contact my representatives, or once this bill starts to make its way through the chambers and gets into the House, as something that's actually going to be voted on.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you know that you have representatives in Ohio that might be interested in it, I think there's value in telling your legislators, like, hey, this is something that's happening back east, or back west rather, northwest, just as a kind of informational thing to them. But yeah, once it starts moving, that's when we need to start getting that broader base of support and getting broader co-sponsors, people in the wings ready to vote yes. And so that's when it kind of comes in like, oh, there is a bill number, and this is the bill number that you need to be looking at. Because right now it's really just a concept. It's not in the like Senate legislative database.
Betsy, do we know which which committee either appropriations or authorization would go into first on the Senate side and then on the House side? Do you know where it would start?
We do not. So it's being introduced by a House person. So it'll go through the House committee side first. And at the federal government level, it can be heard in 2 House committees. And we have a feeling it'll be in House Transportation and Infrastructure, of course. And then we have a feeling the other one will be either Energy and Environment or Natural Resources. So it'll be one of those 3 for sure, probably 2 of those 3. And then it'll move to the Senate side, and it'll go through likely Senate Finance is what we're imagining. But that really comes down to the folks working in the Senate, like their Senate, not the parliamentarian, but those folks, they get to decide. Like basically it goes into the committee that they feel like has the most jurisdiction over the bill, in the Senate at least. And then in the House, they choose the 2 committees that have the most jurisdiction over the bill. And I see a question from Karen saying, do you say the same thing every time you call, or do you change it up? I often don't call from a script. I call from my heart. So I verbally process whatever my thoughts are about the issue that I'm calling about to the staffer. So I change it up every time. I usually have like a general line of attack and talking points in my mind because I've talked or thought about it for that long, but I don't use the same script every time. I try to tell a different story, or at least make it feel a bit more personal. So any other last questions? I know we're kind of here at time, and I do want to make sure that you have a couple of minutes before to call your legislator on behalf of this issue too, before we leave. So awesome. Well, I'll stick around. So if you want to ask anything, I'll be here. But if not, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I'll be following up with all of you guys tomorrow with information about the proposal, the script, all this stuff. But yeah, I challenge you